Hello and welcome to my presentation on polymers and COVID-19. So before we get into the polymer side of COVID, we've got to kind of understand the actual virus itself. So COVID-19 is a severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS for short. The main symptoms include a fever, cough, loss in sense of taste and smell, and fatigue. It first began in Wuhan, China in 2020, and since then it's spread to almost every single country in the world. And it's strongly associated with other SARS-like coronaviruses from bats. And then just to understand the severity of COVID, on the 11th of March 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic posing a significant threat to humanity. So before we start looking at polymers themselves, we've got to understand a little bit about the science behind it. And pretty much every single aspect of the science movement behind COVID involves polymers. Polymers are used in face masks and PPE, PCR tests, treatment, and vaccines. And then just a little example of a polymer is polypropylene. It's one that we will be focusing on a lot in this presentation. It's one of the main polymers found in one of the layers in face masks. And this is because the structure of it is perfect for what we need it for, which we will discuss later on in the PowerPoint. And then there's just a quote at the bottom explaining the importance of polymers. The pandemic crisis that emerged in January 2020 has reinforced the importance of polymers for contemporary society. If in the past consumerism was the driving force behind the application of polymers, nowadays health and medical emergencies are the new forces, which kind of enforces the fact that polymers are going to be a part of our lives for a very, very long time if we want to keep the health sector the way it is right now. So the basics of polymers, there's a little definition at the top of this slide. So polymers is substance made up of very large molecules called macromolecules, which are made up of simpler chemical units called monomers. You can get natural or synthetic polymers. Today we will be looking at examples of both. So the two natural polymers we'll be looking at, and another one, RNA and DNA. And then on the previous slide we did see an example of a synthetic polymer, which was polypropylene, and again polystyrene is another one we'll be looking at. There's just a little fact at the bottom of this slide. The natural polymers RNA and DNA, the polymer chains are actually all the same length, but in synthetic polymers you actually struggle to get this. It's really hard, so you actually lead to a statistical mixture of varied chain lengths. So polymers in PPE. So the three main layers in a fabric mask are an inner layer of absorbent material, such as cotton, then a middle layer of non-absorbent material, which is polypropylene, which we've already seen, but we'll be looking at in more detail right now, and an outer layer of non-absorbent material, such as polyester. So polypropylene, it's non-woven polypropylene in a face mask. It has a very random arrangement of fibres, which makes it perfect for this, because it means that it makes the mask still highly breathable, but does filter out a lot of the particles that we're wanting to filter out. In the surgical mask, it's found as spun-bound polypropylene, and it's made by addition polymerization of propene monomers. And then we've got at the bottom polyester. The two monomers shown on figure 3 are the ones that it is made from. It's made via a condensation reaction between these two monomers. So you've got benzene 1,4-dicarboxylic acid and ethane 1,2-diol. It is moisture resistant, which obviously helps because a lot of moisture comes through the mask. If it can stop that from coming out, it obviously helps the mask and do what it's meant to be there for. It's durable and retains its shape. The only problem with it is it's non-biodegradable, which we will be looking at on the next slide on the environmental impacts. And it is made via a condensation reaction. So the environmental impacts. Mask waste is increasing across the whole world, which is obvious because of the amount of masks that are being used and produced at this level. If you look on figure 1, you can see countries such as India have huge numbers of mask waste compared to other countries. And that's really important when you look at the fact that India don't have any appropriate mask or plastic waste disposal systems in place. So they're usually ending up in aquatic systems or on the streets, which causes huge problems to the aquatic life and the marines and everything. And then you've also got the amount of CO2 per mask, which is increasing the effect of global warming. The N95 mask, which is a type of non-surgical mask, releases 50 grams of CO2 per single mask, which in one mask isn't a lot, but when you're looking at the millions and millions of masks that are being produced every week on figure 1, it's a huge, huge amount of CO2 being put into the atmosphere. Then if you look at figure 2, you can see that burning, mixed waste, throwaway, flushing toilets, hazardous waste, they're all problems. And they outweigh the wash and dispose, which is showing that in this day and age, we are nowhere near the correct disposal systems for polymers. And then it's just a little fact, even with this fact of the environmental impacts, reduction of plastic usage is completely not possible. It is an inevitable part of human behaviour. So we need to come up with another option to manage plastic waste, which governments are doing, but the COVID-19 pandemic has slowly decreased this international agreement to regulate plastic pollution because of the effects that COVID is having.
So we've got polymers in detection now, and the main focus on this is PCR tests. The person that actually discovered PCR tests did win a Nobel Peace Prize because of the impact that this has on science today. The two natural polymers involved in this process are RNA and DNA. Now, PCR tests are very accurate and sensitive tests, which we'll understand just from the process of the PCR test. And not only will RNA and DNA be involved, but there will also be many other polymers involved in the materials used to carry out this test, such as the bag that it comes in, the DNA swab, everything like that will include polymers. So on the right hand side of the slide, we've got a little step-by-step guide of the PCR test. So you obtain the specimen from the sample, which is a human in this case. It usually uses a swab that goes up the nose. Now, the genetic material extracted from coronavirus is RNA, so we have to extract the RNA and convert it to DNA using reverse transcriptase. Then this DNA now is amplified by PCR, which uses primers, which is sections of DNA that is complementary to the DNA or RNA of coronavirus. And this amplifies the DNA. You end up with millions and millions of DNA strands, which means that you can detect even one RNA sample from the human, which means it's a very, very accurate test. And then, unlike many other tests, PCR tests can find evidence of disease in the earliest stage of infection, which is what I said earlier about it being able to detect one piece of RNA. And PCR tests are an accurate and reliable method for identifying many infectious diseases, and because they are often able to make diagnoses before symptoms of infection occur, PCR tests play a crucial role in preventing the spread of diseases, which is everything we're trying to prevent. So now we look at one of the main polymers in the PCR test. It is DNA. It consists of two long polymers. They run in opposing directions and form a double helix structure, which is very important. The monomers are called nucleotides and are composed of a base, a sugar, and a phosphate molecule. And the two strands are held together by hydrogen bonding between the bases. Now, this is an example of a natural polymer, which means that all of the chains will be the same length, which is very rare, obviously, in synthetic polymers, which we discussed earlier. And this is one of the most important natural polymers in the history of polymers. It is so important, and the fact that we managed to discover this means that we have been able to advance in science so much.
Then you have RNA. RNA is formed via a condensation reaction. RNA is actually single-stranded, so there's no double helix structure. It's just one chain running along itself. It contains 4 nitrogenous bases, one of which is uracil. Unlike DNA, it does not contain thymine, it contains uracil instead, but they have a very similar structure. There are different examples of RNA throughout biology, including tRNA and mRNA. And mRNA we will look at more later on in the vaccine section. So polymers in vaccines. You have polymeric nanoparticles. Now these are a relatively new idea in vaccines. They control the delivery to cells, and these vaccines using this are expected to increase immunogenicity in the human body. And then you've got polyethylene glycol, which is one of the first problems that they encountered with the vaccines. It's formed using a ring opening and polymerization of ethylene oxide. And polyethylene glycol is a coating used for the SNLPs, solid lipid nanoparticles. They're found in mRNA vaccines, and this polymer has actually been indicated as a prime suspect for anaphylactic shock, which can be life-threatening. So this is the first instance of polymer where it's not necessarily being used in the correct way and can cause harm to humans. Then we've got polymers in vaccines, another one, mRNA. From the point of view of a polymer chemist, mRNA is an anionic polyelectrolyte made from nucleotide monomers collected via phosphodiester bonds. It's a natural polymer again. An anionic polyelectrolyte has alternating repeating charges on each repeating unit or in a large portion of units. mRNA vaccines use mRNA created in laboratory to teach our cells how to make a protein, which in turn triggers an immune response. Just to finish off, we've got the future of COVID and polymers. Most preventative methods used in preventing the spread of COVID use non-biodegradable polymers. They are inevitable in this section of chemistry. We need them to suppress this COVID. The pandemic has only increased the rapid problem we are facing with plastic waste. So even after all these government protocols and stuff, polymers are still in disasters and stuff like that. They're hugely used. Many organisations are proposing plastic-free programs to businesses to reduce the use of single-use plastics. But the real question is, can we really eliminate the use of polymers in the medical sector and still provide an adequate level of care? But the answer probably is no, because every single aspect of the medical society uses polymers, such as, especially in this area, it's masks, PPE, vaccines, like we said on the previous slides. And some governments, such as England, California, and South Australia, have recently called off the ban on single-use plastics to reduce the coronavirus risk. Now, this probably won't be the first and last pandemic that we face like this. So you're actually looking at more and more pandemics, which will mean more and more plastic waste. This will already have an impact, this coronavirus pandemic, on the environment through polymers for decades. So in decades to come, there could be another outbreak of a virus, another pandemic. We use exactly the same. Then it has another knock-on effect for another couple of decades, and we just never eliminate the fact of polymer problems in this area. That is everything. I hope you've enjoyed this PowerPoint, and I hope it was informative. Thank you.